and welcome to my channel. If you are new here, hi, hey, hello, my name is Meg and we do crafty things here. So if you like crafty things, please do consider subscribing. And if you are a returning subscriber, thank you so much for subscribing and tuning in to another video. So today we're gonna talk crafty motivation. Yes, we are going to talk tips to keep you going on whatever craft it is that you are into heart and soul, okay? These are kind of in an order, but ultimately motivation is subjective. So, you know, whatever your situation is, whatever your personality type, some things will work for you while others don't. So keep that in mind. Not all of these will work for every single person in every situation. So I have kind of loosely listed them from needing the least amount of motivation to motivation is completely gone. What do I do now? Without further ado, let's jump in to these 10 motivational tips. All right, so tip number 1 is to be proactive instead of reactive. Now, if you are at this video, you did a little searchity search, a little googly Google, and you came here because you already have no motivation. This tip is not for you. This tip, however, will be for future you once you have finally got your motivation back and you start crafting again. So this tip is basically me telling you, we all know burnout is going to happen. Okay, at some point or another, you're going to overdo it, you're going to lose inspiration, you're going to become bored with it, whatever the case may be, and this burnout or a lack of motivation is going to happen. So ideally, if you want to keep your craft going, you need to consider pacing it out, okay? For like bracelets, for instance, you wouldn't make 10 bracelets a day, every day, and expect to never hit burnout. That's just ridiculous. That's unlikely, and that is just like, that's the dumbest thing I have ever heard. Realistically, when it comes to friendship bracelets, there are 4 different knots that make up every single friendship bracelet in like the bracelet book database, in the friendship-bracelets database, like forwards, backwards, forwards, backwards, backwards, forwards. There comes a point where your brain is not going to be finding stimulation from that anymore, and it doesn't matter what colors you're using or what pattern you're reading. So you have to be proactive, pace it out, throw in different crafts, mix it up, take a couple days of break. Know that burnout will happen, pace yourself out accordingly, and you will hopefully draw out the amount of time that you're crafting longer than if you were trying to do it just bracelet after bracelet or crochet project after crochet project. Instead of reacting once you're already there, pace it out, and you can draw that time out for as long as possible before you hit that lack of motivation wall, or ultimately and hopefully you don't hit it because you're keeping your mind stimulated enough, you don't reach that point. So tip number 2 is to just sit down and start. In many cases, it is the prospect of sitting down, setting things up, and getting started on the project that is actually daunting. There was a art class that I was in high school where we did a couple projects where the teacher just made us paint our entire canvas a predominant color that was going to be in our design. And the idea was that if you just put something down on the canvas, that daunting feeling of looking at that blank space is suddenly less terrifying because you've already painted your entire canvas orange or pink or blue or whatever. So in many cases, like the how long does it take to make video with the small wall hanging and the pumpkins, like that, it was the sitting down and cutting the strings and picking the colors and getting it all taped and getting the camera set up and all of that. That was more what I was procrastinating than the actual knotting, because I knew, like deep down in my little soul, I knew that once I started, I would have fun because I wanted to make that pattern. So ultimately, just start the project. If it is painting or it is drawing, just put something on your canvas. You know, put your strings out on your dowel, tape down your strings, safety pin your strings, do that base chain, just get it started, and you'll oftentimes find that if you just sit down and do it, you'll start enjoying it and it doesn't seem like a chore anymore. Tip number 3 is to have whips. Now, I don't think I really hear this term used a lot in bracelet making, but in crocheting, in knitting, it's used all the time. And WIP, if you aren't aware, means a work in progress. And the reason I say this kind of ties back to that first tip where I talked about stimulation. You want to stimulate your mind. So having multiple projects on the go, if something is maybe, you know, if you're doing a really big knotting project or a really big crochet or knitting project that is really just labor intensive, there's a lot of detail going into it, or maybe you're designing the pattern yourself and it's taking a lot of brain power to do, have something smaller on the go as well. Take a break from that. Then you can keep crafting and, you know, switch between a couple things, keep it fresh. Because if you're constantly working your mind to full capacity, trying to be analytical and figuring things out, your brain's gonna get tired. It's gonna want, you know, you may still want to knot, you may still find that relaxing and enjoyable, but the actual process of thinking through everything is becoming a little much. And vice versa. You may, if you're only making simple friendship bracelets, your brain is going to become unstimulated. You aren't going to enjoy it anymore, because how many times can you make a chevron or a candy stripe back to back to back without getting bored? It's just not possible. So in my opinion, it's okay to have multiple projects on the go. I certainly do. I've got, sometimes there's kind of bins, and you might be able to see them, I'm not sure if they're in frame, that sit like right over here by my coffee table. And those are literally bins with works in progress in them of some description or another. That could be knotting, it could be knitting, it could be crocheting. Some of you even spotted a big spoiler Easter egg project that I used to have over here. Then I realized that it was in frame with my new setup, so I moved it so y'all can't see what I'm working on because it's a surprise. Spoilers, darling. Okay, spoilers. But have WIPs, have work in projects, have works in progress that you're working on, so you can switch things up and keep things, you know, fresh, keep your mind stimulated, so you're not just pounding away at one project over and over again. So tip number 4 is to listen to or watch something while you're crafting. Now this tip won't be for everyone, because some people are very easily distracted, and putting the TV on may just result in you setting your project down beside you and staring at the TV. So obviously don't do that. Maybe try an audiobook though, or a podcast, something that you don't have to watch. There's no visual stimulation or distraction there. It's just audio. Things that you could put on in the background that still stimulate your brain while you're doing your like 4 knots or your 2 stitches over and over again. It all comes down to keeping your brain stimulated, because when you're not keeping your brain stimulated, that's when you start to lose motivation. That's when you start to get bored. That's when you start to, you know, lose inspiration, is when you're no longer stimulated or interested in what you're doing. So listen to something. And I know Audible is the big audiobook, I almost said ebook, is the big audiobook company that's pressed on everyone, and that is what I use. I've been using Audible for years, not sponsored. But there are other companies. I've used a few of them before. Some of them are much cheaper than Audible, and some of them are even free. Now, like the free one was kind of older books and stuff on it, but if you just want it, you know, give it a quick Google and you'll have 3 or 4 different ones show up without a doubt. That's why I always include what I'm watching or listening in my monthly wrap-ups, because to me, they go hand in hand. It definitely helps keep your mind stimulated. Now, number 5, at this point, in my mind, if you've reached kind of the mid-list, you're at a point where you've kind of lost motivation, or you're at a point where you're like, ugh, I don't know what to make. So this tip is to search for inspiration. Like there's a lot of times where inspiration will just come from day-to-day objects, and that is fantastic. If you're, you know, in the peak of your crafting and you can sit down and just, you know, you're like, ah, oh, yes, pull an idea right from your noggin. That is wonderful. But let's be honest, that doesn't always happen. So watch YouTube videos, watch other creators that are doing the crafts you're doing, check out Pinterest, check out Instagram. There's so many different techniques, and there's so many different just interpretations of things and remakes of things. Like I've recently been watching a few different crochet channels react to their followers' creations. And a few of them, like the last one I watched, the girl posts patterns on her YouTube, and 4 or 5 different people made the same shirt, but they all looked completely different because of how they decided to use the wool, what textures they decided to use, that sort of thing. So you can find inspiration and techniques and everything from the simplest of things, but sometimes you just can't come up with it on your own. So you have to actively look. Keep a Pinterest board, you know, take your screenshots, save them on your phone, do whatever you got to do to actively find inspiration. Which kind of leads into tip number 6, which is find a new location. If you are at this point and you've been, I don't know, sitting in your bedroom for the last 6 hours, only knotting bracelets and watching Netflix, I can tell you why you don't have motivation to start a new project. And it's because you've been sitting in one place for 6 hours knotting bracelets or knitting projects and watching Netflix. No shame, we have all done it. I have done it. I'm sure most of you have done it. We've all been there. But if you're at a point of you really can't find motivation, sometimes a change of location, even if it's still within your house, can do wonders. If you're able to take your knotting or your knitting or your project bag to the park, for instance, sit at a picnic table, even if you're not interacting with anyone, there's different sounds, there's different sights, there's different smells, there's all kinds of different things going on that your brain picks up on, whether you do consciously or not realize that. And that extra bit of stimulation is going to do you wonders. And also, like, fresh air is good for you, so that's like an added bonus. But if you're sitting at the park, and I do that so much in the summer when it's hot out, I will sit out on my balcony like every day because I just love like the feeling of the heat. I love the feeling of like the scent of all my flowers when I'm sitting out there. I love, you know, the sounds of the different cars and stuff going by. It just is that much more stimulating than sitting at this very spot at this table knotting, or sitting on that couch 2 feet away from me and knotting. You know, changing to another room where different people are and they're making noise, or going outside, going to the park, sitting by a river, sitting by the lake, going to the beach. All of these things, even if you're still doing your craft, can definitely increase your motivation and make it just more enjoyable and stimulating for your brain, even if you're not actively stimulating it yourself by like using audiobooks or music or, you know, YouTube videos or whatever in the background, like that earlier tip. Now, number 7 is to work in bursts, or I sometimes call it a reward system. And this can be applied to basically everything. So the main thing that I tend to do is I double it with chores, because I have a hard time finding motivation to, for example, fold laundry. I hate folding laundry, but I also recognize that if you don't fold your laundry, it just looks wrinkly and gross. So you gotta fold the laundry. So what I'll often do is I will make myself a deal. I'll be like, okay, I'll pull my laundry over to the seat beside me here, and I'll have a bracelet here, and I go, you know what? I'm going to knot 5 rows of my pattern. Once I've knotted 5 rows of my pattern, I'll fold 5 pieces of clothes. But the same thing can kind of be applied. If you're not super enjoying a pattern you're working on, for instance, or it's just very time consuming and detail oriented, maybe you work on that pattern for, you know, maybe it's a time for you. Maybe, you know, a few lines, it doesn't seem fair. And yes, I get that sometimes. I'm like, oh, but that 5 rows went by so quick, and those 5 pairs of pants is not going by quick at all. So sometimes it's just time. I'll set timers sometimes where I'm like, you know what? I'm going to do 45 minutes of this work I absolutely have to do and absolutely don't want to. And then I'll give myself 10 or 15 minutes of doing whatever this thing is that I want to do. So this doesn't have to be that way. You don't have to add chores into your mix, but I'm saying, like, if you're having a hard time or you're struggling your way through a pattern and you just really want to finish it, you know, you've dedicated too much time and energy to it to just drop it now. Maybe pair that with reading a good book, or maybe pair that with a pattern you are really enjoying. And this makes it just seem much more like easily digestible. It's a lot more like little bite-sized pieces. Nothing really seems like a chore because you're not just sitting and like folding laundry nonstop, and you're not just, you know, procrastinating and knowing that that's not being done in the back of your head because you're sitting and just knotting your bracelet. Or the same can be said for, you know, whatever your craft is, like, oh, you've been dragging your feet through that pattern, but then you kind of give yourself a little reward and you're like, if I knot 5 rows of my pattern, I can read 2 pages of my book or whatever. But I often find this really, really works because I don't feel like you're focusing on anything long enough for it to become exhausting or draining or tedious. So that one I often do. I do that tip a lot. Now my 8th tip is to experiment. Whatever craft you are into, whether that is knitting, whether that is crocheting, whether that is knotting, whether that's, I don't know, Rex, lace, cross stitch, embroidery, whatever, try experimenting. Try doing a technique you haven't tried before. Try coming up with your own technique. Try using a color palette you couldn't think of before or hadn't used before, or just try something new within your craft. And a lot of the times it's easy to get complacent and kind of stay in the techniques and stuff that we're comfortable with. You know, try something new or create something new, experiment yourself, because there is so many things and so many ideas out there on the internet and so many different techniques for really cool things that you can find everywhere and that I'm sure are yet to be created. And that could trigger your motivation again because you've stimulated your brain and you're like, oh, this is cool. This is turning out awesome. And suddenly your project is exciting again. And that's what we all want. Like, we all want it to be exciting. We all want it to be fun. We all want to get to the end product and be like, oh my gosh, I made this and it's so cool. So cool. So just experiment. Really, it helps a lot. That's literally the whole reason why I started my Knotting Dangerously series on this channel, was to just experiment with different textures, experiment with different strings and techniques. Like, that is literally why I started that series on this channel. Number 9 is literally try a new craft. At this point, we're almost at the bottom of the list. So like, if you're needing the level of help at this point, then the answer might be that you need to give the craft you're working on a break, or whatever you're working on a break. So try a new craft, try a new hobby. It doesn't necessarily have to be a craft. Try something new. Maybe you've never crocheted before, but you've kind of been thinking about it. You've only been at knotting bracelets. Maybe you crochet and you find out you like crocheting a lot better than knotting bracelets. Or maybe you crochet but you haven't knit before and you find out like, hey, knitting looked like this super complicated thing, but it's actually really enjoyable. I really like it. Or, you know, try new things and just breaking that up, giving yourself space from your main craft or your main hobby or whatever it is you're working on will oftentimes allow you the break so that when you go back to it, when that urge hits you again, you know, it's enjoyable. And that kind of, this tip kind of ties into the having works in progress. Your works in progress don't have to be all for the same craft. In fact, I do so many crafts outside of what you guys see on this channel because I know that if I sit on one craft too long, I will get bored. So that is my like big thing. And especially when it comes to online and communities, you kind of become part of a community when you get into a craft. Like maybe it's a lot of knitters that you follow on Instagram, or a lot of bracelet makers that, you know, like for instance, bracelets specifically, all of the patterns are posted on forum websites. So when you get into braceletbook.com, when you get into friendship-bracelets.net, they're all honestly like attached to a community already. There's chat boxes, there's forums, and sometimes you want to craft because you want to stay a part of the community. So try a different craft. Like there's so many things that you can make with an alpha grid pattern. That is a standard grid pattern. You can cross stitch with that. You could do perler beads. You can crochet it as a chart. You can knit it as a chart. There's so many things that you can do with like those patterns and still be a part of the community because you're still using those patterns. If you are sick of tying bracelets and you want to try crocheting chart patterns, maybe a wall tapestry or something, you could still be a part of the community. Not a problem. All right, so if you've reached tip number 10, you are the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario. And honestly, tip number 10 is to stop. If you are at that point, maybe it's just time to step back. If you can't find motivation in another craft, if you can't find motivation through trying anything else, sometimes just stress and life and other things, it's not just the craft, and you may think it's just the craft, like I just can't find motivation for my craft. But sometimes you just need to step back. And I've had to do that a couple times throughout the history of my channel, which is why there's been a few months where I've just like dropped off the face of the planet for like a month at a time, and there's maybe been no upload or like one upload. And that's because I had pushed myself too far, too thin on too many fronts. But sometimes that's just what you gotta do. Sometimes you just need a break, and that's okay. Eventually it comes back around, and you know, I sit down and I enjoy it again. And I feel like a lot of people have this idea that it's not okay to just stop something, like they have to keep going. And it's a hobby. Like we're talking about knotting and craft specifically, it's a hobby. So it's only as much of a job as you are making it. So if it is your job, then, you know, stopping might not be an option if that's like your sole income. But hopefully if you're in that position, you have paced yourself accordingly, and you have techniques and stuff that you've created to help kind of give yourself a little bit of a buffer from getting to burnout or depression or whatever. So basically, it's okay to stop if you have to stop. And if you are desperately at that point, maybe you just have to stop. All right, so hopefully come the bottom of this list here, you have found at least one of these has been helpful to you. If you have, let me know which one down below. Which one was the most helpful to you? And if you have any other tips, also leave them down below so we can help each other out and, you know, help out, keep our little crafting community motivated, because we all want to craft things. That's why we're here, right? And hopefully this wasn't too boring for you, just watching me blab on. Otherwise, if you did enjoy it and you did find it useful, please give it a big thumbs up. And until next time, guys, bye.